top scientist who discovered the Alexander Litvinenko poison was stabbed himself to death with 2 knives after a trip to Russia, we hear this week. This is from the Mirror. The father of 2 reportedly died from self-inflicted injuries, despite one detective believing he couldn't have stayed conscious long enough to wound himself that much. The radiation expert who discovered the poison that killed Alexander Litvinenko, he committed suicide, apparently, by stabbing himself repeatedly with 2 knives months after a trip to Russia. A coroner has ruled Matthew Puncher, 46, bled to death at his home after receiving multiple stab wounds across his body from 2 kitchen knives. The inquest heard a pathologist said he could not completely exclude the possibility that someone else had been involved.
Where did this take place, Tony?
In the UK.
In the UK.
He's an expert in radiation protection dosimetry and worked for the Public Health England and the UK's Atomic Energy Research Establishment at Harwell in Oxfordshire.
Well, one of the things that hasn't been really highlighted in the Western media is that the polonium trail, because they found polonium all over the place after Litvinenko died, they found some at Berezovsky's office, who was one of the allies of Litvinenko. And in actual fact had something to gain by killing Litvinenko because he wanted to create an incident of hostility between Russia and the West. Now, it's possible that this guy knows too much, but he wouldn't necessarily have been killed by the Russians. And that's not to say that the Russians aren't capable of carrying out these kind of acts. They probably are, but then so are our own lot. And the question is, what happened in each individual case?
I mean, I just described this online last night as more of a silo of snakes than a can of worms, this case, because it's absolutely enormous, isn't it? It goes right the way back to how Putin came to power.
It does go, and it's extraordinary that of all of the things that they throw at Putin, they don't throw at him that he may have been involved in the bombings in Moscow and Ryazan in 1998. And you know why that is? Because at that stage he was an ally of Berezovsky, who was working with the Western intelligence services to frustrate the electoral victory which was looking on the cards for Zyuganov, who was the head of the Russian Communist Party. And Zyuganov is still the head of the Russian Communist Party, and he's a critical supporter of Putin's foreign policy. But the whole thing was directed at him. Now, strangely enough, Berezovsky was pushing for them to go on about how Putin had been involved in bombing Moscow and Ryazan in 1998, because he knew that Putin was involved in it, because he helped Putin to plan it. Well, but at the same time, of course, that was opened the whole can of worms, because that was all done with the knowledge of the Western intelligence services, because they wanted to stop the communists winning the election.
Let's see if we can avenge the death a little of Matthew Puncher, who clearly didn't stab himself with 2 knives.
Any more than Gary Webb shot himself in the head with 2 bullets when he exposed the Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s.
By looking at Putin's right to power, because this is what the key thing about Litvinenko is. He wrote this book, didn't he, Blowing Up Russia, about Putin's rise to power, and it is absolutely fascinating reading. It's also quite a lot of internet documentaries, and when I get back home this evening I'll put a link to one of the best ones of them, and this was the Russian NTV, which was the first independent television station to open up after 1990.
It was owned by Berezovsky.
Yes, it was owned by Berezovsky, but it was all about that bomb attack. And what they did, it's a fascinating bit of footage, is where they actually got in the studio loads of residents from the from the housing estate where these bombs were found, along with some of the chiefs of the local police and the secret police, the FSB, from Moscow in the studio at the same time. And it's absolutely incredible to see the locals challenging these Secret Service chiefs over basically calling them out as liars.
Well, what happened was that the local police arrested 2 guys, and they checked the holdall. They were carrying a bomb, and it turned out they were FSB. That bomb in that case didn't go off. But of course the suspicion was that it was blamed on the Chechens, but it was actually carried out by the FSB. And the reason that the motive for this was because the communists were going to win the election. Don't forget that the people's living standards had collapsed because of the Thatcherite policies that had been pursued and so on.
And if you go down the rabbit hole a little further, we find the figure of Vladimir Putin actually helping to cover up that bomb attack and then being trusted by Berezovsky. And actually maybe a little bit later turning the tables on Berezovsky.
Well, what was bizarre about Berezovsky, he knew that he and Putin, because Berezovsky was the head of the oligarchs, he was the chief oligarch, he ran NTV.
And also they were taking over loads and loads of public
they basically stole basically stole the public sector in Russia was stolen by them, and they made a lot of money out of it. But of course, the effect on ordinary people have been absolutely dramatically bad. And by 1998, they were ready to vote for the communists. The opinion polls showed, and it happened elsewhere in Eastern Europe as well. Even in Poland, where I used to live, the Communist Party won the second election, and they won the second election in virtually every East European country once people had a good dose of Thatcherism rammed down their throats. So it was perfectly feasible and natural for the Russians to vote for the communists. But that wouldn't have been acceptable to the oligarchy in Russia, and it wasn't acceptable to the Western powers. So they cooked up the whole thing, and Berezovsky had links with the Chechen rebels, including Dudayev, who then invaded Dagestan, I think it was, even though they'd already won their independence. There was no reason for them to do that, and there was no reason for them to bomb Moscow either. They'd already won their independence. There was no reason for them to do any of it. The point was that then Putin, as a sort of a man on a white horse, rides in and saves the day. But of course, Putin, having saved the day for the oligarchy, then said, right, you owe me, you lot. I am now going to discipline you.
And in fact,
that's what he did.
In fact, what he said, wasn't it, to Berezovsky, is you've got 24 hours to leave the country, otherwise you're going to be arrested.
They fell out. Berezovsky recruited Putin and spoke to Yeltsin and said, look, we need Putin to
So Berezovsky was hoping that Putin was going to be his puppet as a president.
Yep. But he wasn't.
An interesting, fascinating story. And let's hope there's no more deaths involved with this, because it's absolutely horrendous that someone should die such a
what's interesting to me about it is that, in actual fact, the evidence suggests that Litvinenko may not have been killed by the Russians. My money is on Berezovsky's people killing him, because they needed a further incident between Russia and the West so that they could then push for Berezovsky to replace Putin. Berezovsky's aspiration was to replace Putin as leader of Russia.
You see, people think you can't get to the bottom of this stuff, but I think you can, and I'm going to put up a couple of links for folks that are a bit sceptical about this on the show page at thisweek.org.uk tonight, hopefully to show that you can actually open up that silo full of snakes and find out what really happened.
Getting bigger by being better. The number one choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.